Hi everyone. Today I'll be presenting proactive control and the processing of field gaps in English wh dependencies. And before we go into details about this topic, there are some technical terms as we can see from the topic. And I would like to explain these technical terms first before we go into the details of this study, right? The first one is proactive control, which is a type of cognitive control. And the second one is field gap, which is a special phenomenon in English wh dependency sentences. And the third one is English wh dependencies. I'm going to talk about these technical terms first. So if you are familiar with these technical terms, you can take this chance as a refreshment. If you are not familiar, this is the chance for you to get a bit to know about what these terms mean, right? So let's get started with the cognitive control. What is cognitive control? Basically, cognitive control refers to how one manages thoughts and behaviors to achieve internal goals. So imagine that if you are working in your office, and now it's lunchtime, you are hungry. So your goal or your internal goal is to find something to eat because you are hungry. And what's your behavior? You might need to open the door and leave the office to go to find a restaurant or anything to eat. So cognitive control might come into play to manage your thoughts and behavior. Your thought is finding something to eat, and your behavior is leaving the office, right? And cognitive control is domain general. Just now in the example, it is not language specific. It is not related to language per se, but it's more domain general. Domain general can be thought of as non-linguistic in the case, all right? So according to the dual mechanisms of control framework by Braver 2012, the model divides cognitive control into two types. The first one is reactive control, which refers to the passive reactivation of your goals in memory. And in terms of the other type, it is proactive control, which refers to the active maintenance of goals in memory. And there are some characteristics of these two types of cognitive control. For the reactive control, it is less effortful, and it is transient in duration. And on the other hand, for proactive control, it is more effortful, and it is sustaining or lasting in terms of the duration. This might be a bit abstract, but I'm going to give you some examples from Braver 2012. So let's talk about reactive control first. In terms of reactive control, we mentioned just now, it is less effortful and it is transient. It refers to the idea of reactivating your goal in memory. So in our daily case, you can imagine that you are now at work and you get the information or get the reminder that you have to get grocery after work. If you are more reactive, or if you are exercising your reactive control, you would know that, oh, I have to go grocery, or I have to go grocery after work. But then your attention will be shifted to your work in the office, and you will put aside the reminder of getting grocery after work. You will put it aside, and then you would focus more on your work in the office. Later, when it's time for you to leave the office, you forget about it. You forget about you have to go for grocery. But when you go to your car, suddenly you see your car and realize you have to go for grocery. So when you see the queue of your car, you realize you have to go for grocery. The idea of getting grocery is reactivated, right? So as we can see here, it's less effortful. Reactive control is less effortful because when you get the cue, when you get the information, you are going to put it aside first, and then you probably will forget about it. And the information is transient in terms of the duration because you put it aside. But on the other hand, in terms of the proactive control, you are going to maintain your goal in your memory for a longer period of time, and it's more effortful. So in the similar case, now you get the information of getting grocery after work. And you would keep reminding yourself, I have to do grocery shopping after work while you are focusing on your work in the office. So you are actually doing the two tasks at the same time. While you are focusing on your work in the office, you are also reminding yourself you have to get grocery after work. So you are maintaining the two information at the same time. So it is more effortful. And when it's time for you to leave the office, you would go directly to your car and go for grocery immediately. So usually things can be done on schedule. So it is more effortful and it's sustaining because you have to keep it active in your working memory. All right. So these are the two types of cognitive control: reactive control and proactive control. And in the current study, I'm going to focus more on the proactive control. So that's the first technical term, cognitive control and proactive control. Now let's talk about English WH dependencies. So what are English WH dependencies? The examples are English WH dependency sentences, such as who did you meet at the party last night versus who met you at the party last night. There are some characteristics of an English WH dependency sentence. As we can see from these examples, the characteristics of English WH dependency sentences contained a WH word. In this case, it's who. And it also has another characteristics. That is, the WH word has to be associated with a verb downstream. So in this case, it's meet or met. And the third characteristics is the association can be adjacent or non-adjacent. So in the first example, who did you meet at the party last night? The association is non-adjacent because who and meet is separated by did and you in between. But it can be adjacent as in the second example, who and met appears next to each other, right? So these are the characteristics of English WH dependencies. And how do people in the literature conceptualize English WH dependencies? Usually they are often conceptualized as a filler filling a gap. So the filler here means the WH word, and the gap means the target word or target verb that the WH word has to be associated with, and there would be a gap right after the target verb that the WH word has to be associated with. But not all the researchers agree this conceptualization. And for simplicity, in the current study, we are using this conceptualization of a filler gap dependency, or WH word acting as a filler, filling a gap right before the verb that it is associated with, right? So that's the second technical term. And then we are going to focus. So now we are going to talk about some theories that account for how we process English WH dependencies. Before that, we know that relative clause is a type of WH dependency sentences because for relative clause, it contains a WH word, and the WH word has to be associated with another word downstream, and the association can be adjacent or non-adjacent. So we are going to use relative clauses as an example. The first clause is SRC, which stands for subject extractive relative clause. And the second one is ORC, which stands for object extractive relative clause. These two sentences use exactly the same word, but the word order is a bit different in the embedded clause or the relative clause, right? And there are a lot of approaches that explain how we process WH dependency sentences. And I'm going to focus on the memory-based approach or memory-based models. According to memory-based models, when we encounter WH dependency sentences, in this case, the relative clause, when we encounter the WH word, we have to keep it in our working memory during processing, right? Until the WH word can be integrated or associated with the target verb or the gap. Before that, we have to hold it in our working memory according to the model. And we have a preference for the closest gap. This is because if you have to maintain the information of WH word in your working memory, it is cognitively costly if you have to maintain the information longer in your working memory. So that's why we prefer to have the closest gap so that we can minimize the cognitive cost for the processing. So you can probably guess that SRC might be easier to process than ORC because the distance between the WH word or the filler and the gap is much shorter than ORC, as you can see here. So according to the memory-based model, SRC is processed easier than ORC. And in the present study, due to the experimental manipulation and design, we are going to, our sentences are ORC-like sentences in which the WH word is the object of the sentence instead of serving as the subject of the sentence. Right. So let's talk about the field gap effect. The field gap effect is a special phenomenon in WH dependency sentences. So just now we talked about WH dependency sentences, such as my brother wanted to know who Ruth will bring home to mom at Christmas. When we read this sentence, upon encountering the WH word, we are expecting the WH word to fill the closest gap, which is the position right after the verb bring, right? So according to the memory-based model, the closest gap is preferred and expected because it can minimize the processing cost. But there are some situations when this gap, the position right after bring is filled, as you can see here. My brother wanted to know who Ruth will bring us home to at Christmas. So when we encounter the unexpectedly filled gap, our parsing might be disrupted, or we might stumble at this position like us, because we expected it to be a gap initially, but now it is unexpectedly occupied because this is the closest gap, and we will stumble at the sentence. So now we have to go back to read the sentence again and reanalyze the sentence. When we stumble at the position of the pronoun, this is our parsing is disrupted, and the disruption is known as the field gap effect, right? So this will lead to the reanalysis of the sentence. So we have to reanalyze the sentence and look for another gap downstream, right? So far so good. So we talk about cognitive control, and we talk about English WH dependencies, and we also talk about the field gap effect in English WH dependencies. So what does all these have to do with each other, or what do they have in common, and why bother talking about them? So in this slide, I'm going to combine the concepts together, which is the essence of the present study. So that is, we are bridging proactive control and the processing of English WH dependencies. Quick refreshment. In terms of the proactive control, it refers to maintaining your goal in your memory. So in the example just now, it's the grocery example. While you are focusing on your work, you are still remembering you have to get grocery after work. That's the proactive control. So remember that you have to keep the information in your, at least, the memory system, right? And in terms of the memory-based models that explains how we process English WH dependencies, it says that when we encounter the WH word, we have to keep it in our working memory during parsing. So did you notice that there seems to be an overlapping mechanism between proactive control and the processing of English WH dependency sentences? At least your memory system might be involved, right? So here, our reasoning would be if we can bias people or if we can manipulate people's proactivity, that is, we are biasing people to exercise different extents of proactive control. We are sort of pushing them to exercise the underlying mechanism to different extents. And we are expecting that this manipulation can be spilled over to sentence processing later, all right? That's the reasoning and the essence of the current study. So we can make sort of some interesting predictions. Here, as you can see, this is the closest gap. So if you are more proactive, you might be more efficient in terms of the association. Because if you are more proactive, you are going to expect a gap. You are more likely to expect a gap when you read WH dependency sentences, and you are more proactive, you can be more efficient in the association. But when such gap or the closest gap is unexpectedly occupied, if you are more proactive, then that might come as a disadvantage. Because if you are more proactive, you are more likely to expect a gap. But now the gap is unexpectedly filled. So you have to undo your initial expectation. And then you have to reanalyze the sentence. So it's more effortful to recover from such unexpectedness if you are more proactive, right? So that's the reasoning of the study and how we combine proactive control and the processing of English WH dependencies, right? So here comes the research question and our prediction. So just now we've mentioned that proactive control and the processing of English WH dependencies sort of have some overlapping underlying mechanisms. So our research question is, can exercising proactive control to different extents modulate the processing of the filled gap in English WH dependencies? If so, how? Since they have some overlapping underlying mechanisms, we think that when people are biased to exercise proactive control to different extent, these differences might be spilled over to sentence processing. So our prediction is yes, and the modulation can be reflected by neural responses as reflected by ERPs and TFRs. TFR stands for time frequency representation. So we are focusing on some of the brainwave components like left anterior negativity, N400, P600. And for the time frequency representation, we are focusing on theta, alpha, lower beta, and upper beta frequency bands, all right? And let's talk about ERPs and TFRs for real quick. Again, if you are familiar with the concept, you can take it as a refreshment. ERP stands for event-related brain potential, and TFR stands for time frequency representation. For ERP, if you are recording a continuous brain wave, and for ERP, it's a technique that you would extract the snippet of the brain wave that are related to certain event. So for instance, if you are conducting an emotional study, then you ask participants to read pictures or to look at pictures that are related to positive emotion or negative emotion. And for ERP technique, you are extracting the snippet of all positive emotions, and then you would average the brain wave, and then you get a average brain wave that are related to the positive emotion event, right? That's ERP. But for time frequency representation, it is another technique that you are really looking into the brain wave. You are decompose the brain wave, and you are extracting the sinusoidal wave from the wave you extracted, all right? So this might be a bit abstract, but I would like to use the pizza analogy. So imagine that you have 3 pizzas and it represents the ERP components. So sometimes ERP and TFR can complement each other because TFR can capture the information that ERP cannot capture or are not so sensitive at. So imagine that you have 3 pizzas and you are comparing pizza A and pizza B. Probably you cannot tell the differences between these 2 pizzas because they are so similar. So the same, by this analogy, in ERP, if you are comparing the components and you find no differences, that might be because the differences might cancel each other out. So in the case of pizza, you cannot really tell differences between them. But in ERPs, you can also tell the differences between pizza A and pizza C, or pizza B and pizza C. But sometimes you might be unlucky to get pizza A and pizza B, so you cannot tell the difference. But time frequency representation can help you extract the information. What time frequency representation is doing is to extract the ingredient from the pizza. So because pizza A and pizza B are so similar, so we cannot tell the difference. I mean, when we compare these two pizza as a whole, we cannot tell the differences. But now if you use time frequency representation technique, you are really extracting the ingredients. So when you compare the ingredients directly, which are sine waves, it becomes easier to tell the differences, right? So that's the advantage of time frequency representation, and it can complement ERP analysis. That's why we look into two different brainwave signals in the current study. Right. So let's move on to talk about present study. The present study is a brainwave study or EEG study, and we are looking into the ERPs and TFRs. We have a 2x2 experiment, and we manipulate the between subject factor of proactivity and the within subject factor of gap type. So everything will become clear in the later slides. In terms of the participants, there are 67 participants that are included in our analysis. And these participants are separated into two groups, the more proactive group and the less proactive group, right? In terms of our manipulation of participants' proactivity, we use the AX-CPT task or AX continuous performance task. This is a super boring task, and it's a torture to the participants, but it is found to be sensitive to distinguish people's proactivity. So we use this task, but it's super boring. And a typical AX-CPT task can be used to capture one's tendency of being proactive or reactive. So a typical AX-CPT is composed of Q-probe pairs. So these Q-probe pairs can be divided into 4 conditions: AX, AY, BX, and BY conditions, as you can see in the example. And note that A and X, they are constant letters, meaning that the letters will not change during the experiment. But B and Y are variable letters. They can be any letter except for A and X. And what participants have to do during the experiment is the Q and probe pair will be presented one by one. And participants have to respond when they see the probe. So when QA is followed by probe X, participants have to press yes button. And in other combinations, they have to press the no button, right? And in the typical AX-CPT task, there are more numbers of the AX trials. It accounts for 70% of the trials, so that it will bias participants to expect probe X when they see QA, right? Because there's more numbers of AX, so participants will get used to that. And when they see QA, they are going to expect probe X during the experiment. So if participants are more proactive, meaning that when they see QA, they are going to expect probe X. They are more likely to expect probe X. If they are more proactive, they are going to make more errors in the AY condition. Because in the AY condition, when they see QA, they are expecting the probe to be X. But now the probe is not X, it's not as expected, but they are expecting it to appear to be X. So they will be more likely to make mistakes. And if participants are more reactive, they are going to make more errors in the BX condition, because the probe X in the BX condition might come as an interference with the AX probe, right? So if you are more reactive, you are going to make more errors in the BX condition. This is what a typical AX-CPT task will do. For the current experiment, we are using 2 variants of the AX-CPT task. And this is following Garcia et al. 2016, because in their experiment, their manipulation of the AX-CPT task can bias participants to be in a different proactive mode. So we follow their design and we use it in the current study. Our design is a bit different from a typical AX-CPT, but the idea is the same. right? So we created two versions of the AXCPT, the more proactive version and the less proactive version. For the more proactive version, we have additional instruction to the participants, telling them that A is very likely to be followed by X. So by this instruction, we are hoping to bias participants to expect X more so that they can be more proactive during the experiment. And another version is less proactive version. So in this version, we don't provide additional instruction that A is very likely to be followed by X. Besides, we have additional condition, which is a letter digit condition. The letter digit condition, when participants encounter the digit probe, they have to withhold their responses. So this makes the probe more unpredictable, so that participants will not be proactive, or they cannot be proactive because the probe now becomes more unpredictable in the experiment, right? So participants in this experiment would join one version of the AXCPT, but not two, because it's a between participant design, meaning that they can only join one of the versions. And we would do the random assignment to the, we would randomly assign the participants to one of the versions. And this is the presentation of the AXCPT task in the lab. First, participants will see a fixation to remind them that they have to look at the center, look into the center of the screen. And then the Q would be popping up, and then followed by a blank. Then the probe would be coming up. Upon seeing the probe, they have to respond to the probe, right? So the manipulation, the essence of our manipulation is to bias participants to be in a different proactive mode so that they can use proactive control to different extents, right? That's how we manipulate proactivity tendencies in the experiment. As for sentence reading, we created English WH dependency sentences by manipulating the gap type. So just now we've mentioned about the field gap, right? So in the first sentence, the beef which the grandfather chopped the pepper for was rather tender and succulent. So this is a field gap condition because according to the memory-based model, the closest gap is expected to be, But now the closest gap, which is the position right after the verb, is occupied by the noun phrase, the pepper. So participants might be stumble at the sentence when they encounter the pepper. So this is so-called field gap condition. But for the non-field gap condition, we have a fronted preposition along with the WH word. This would disambiguate the gap downstream, meaning that participants would not expect a gap right after chop because of for which would disambiguate the gap. I myself don't really have the intuition about it, but I believe native speakers might tell the differences between these two types. Right. And the presentation of the sentence is presented word by word, right? So first, they're going to see a fixation telling them to be focused. And then the sentence will be presented by the first word all the way to the last word. And then we would have a comprehension question or true-false verification question as an attention check. Right. So this is the sentence examples. And our critical words are the target verb and the determiner and the noun phrase, because we think that if any modulation effect might occur, it might occur in these regions or in these critical words. Right. And this is a brief summary of our manipulation. The first one is the AXCPT task. And the essence of the AXCPT task is to bias participants to be in a different proactive mode, either more proactive or less proactive. And then they are going to read the sentences, which is WH dependency sentences that are of field gap or not field gap conditions. And the procedure of the experiment goes like this. First, participants would do the AXCPT task for about 20 minutes to 24 minutes. And right after they finish the session, they read the sentences right after the session, right? So our analysis for the AXCPT task, we included the accuracy rate that are above 60% or equal to 60% in the AXCPT task following Gansier 2016. And for the sentence part, we accept the attention check that are over 80% or equal to 80% accuracy rate in the study. And we use linear mixed effects model and permutation test we use permutation test for time frequency analysis and linear mixed effects model for ERP analysis. So for the AXCPT result, you can see from the graph, visual inspection might tell you there's some different patterns between less proactive and more proactive group. So as you can see from the blue color and red color, the pattern is a bit different and they belong to different groups. Here, the same, you can see different patterns between less proactive and more proactive group, right? So our visual inspection is verified by statistical analysis or statistical result. The result here are reached statistical significance. And I'm happy to talk about the details and reasoning in the Q&A session if you are interested. But basically, the results tell us that the essence of the result tells us that our proactivity manipulation worked in the study, right? The same applies for the error rate analysis. So again, by visual inspection, you can probably tell there's some differences between less proactive and more proactive group. So as you can see here, from the blue color and the red color, and also the pattern here on the right-hand side, there seems to be a bit different from these groups. And this visual inspection is verified by our statistical result, as you can see here. Again, if you are interested, I'm happy to talk about the reasoning, but the essence of the result shows that our proactivity manipulation worked, right? So this is exciting because it means that our AXCPT manipulation worked so that it makes sense for us to look further for the sentence processing. And we want to know if our manipulation can be spilled over to sentence processing. This is a brief summary. The result of reaction time and error rate analysis revealed that our proactivity manipulation in the experiment worked. And let's take a look at the ERP result. So we can take a look at the sentences here. What we have found is we indeed found a modulation effect, meaning that there's an interaction between domain general proactive control and sentence processing. And for the ERP result, we found the interaction occurring in the determiner, right? A modulation effect is reflected by N400, the N400 brainwave component. And interestingly, this modulation effect occurs only when people are biased to be less proactive. So we observe a field gap effect, meaning that the field gap parsing will be disrupted for the field gap. So it elicited a larger N400 component. But this effect occurs only in people who are biased to be less proactive. So our interpretation of this is people might rely more on semantic information to process the gap side when they are biased to be less proactive mode. So why semantic information? Because N400 component is related to semantic processing. So our interpretation relies on that. And we think that people might rely more on semantic information when they are biased to be less proactive mode. The TFR result provides a complementary result. Again, our critical words are here, and our based on the graph, the frequency bands that reached statistical significance is marked by the red box. And we are taking a closer look at the red box. So we can take a look at this. We indeed found a modulation effect, which is reflected by the upper beta frequency band. And this is also a field gap effect, because for the upper beta frequency, if sentences are not disrupted, it would elicit a larger beta power. But when it is disrupted, then the beta power would decrease. So that's why the field gap has a lower or smaller beta power. So this is a field gap effect. And this field gap effect happens only in people who are biased to be more proactive. So it seems to be complement the ERP result. And our interpretation of this is people who are biased to be more proactive, they are going to rely more on syntactic information for the gap side processing. Right? So ERP results and TFR results seem to complement each other. And this is a brief summary of what we have found. For ERP result, people who are biased to be less proactive shows the effect. But for TFR result, people who are biased to be more proactive shows the effect. Right? So going back to our research question and prediction, can exercising proactive control to different extent modulate the processing of field gap in English WH dependencies? If so, how? So based on our result, our answer is yes, and such modulation might be reflected, and we indeed see the differences in the N400 component and the upper beta frequency band in the TFR result. So the conclusion of the study is we manipulated the domain general factor of proactivity, and we also manipulated the language specific factor of gap type, and we are looking into the interaction between them. In our result, we found an interaction between our manipulation of proactivity and gap type. Specifically, when people are biased to be less proactive, they are going to rely more on semantic information for the processing. And this is reflected by the ERP component of N400. And if people are biased to be more proactive, they're going to rely more on syntactic information for the processing. And this is reflected by the upper beta frequency band in the time frequency analysis. So our findings can support the memory or resources-based models, and it can reveal that modulation effect can occur between domain general proactive control and language-specific processing of English WH dependencies, meaning that language processing might not be independent per se. It has to interact with other domain general or non-linguistic cognitive processes. That's the take-home message of the study. And lastly, I would like to thank people who have helped me, especially the B Lab members and the Dean Wall Foundation for supporting the study. Thank you.